The annual summer fete at St. Mudwin's Church was the sort of event that belonged more to memory than to modern life. Bunting flapped gently along the hedgerows. Elderflower cordial sat in sweating glass jugs upon wobbling wooden tables. The Women's Institute had produced cakes as ambitious as they were calorific, and the vicar's wife had finally persuaded her cousin Gerald to judge the homemade jam competition. A task he accepted with the dramatic reluctance of a man asked to choose his favorite child. Little Chipping was in full celebration. Children sprinted through the village green with sticky fingers and painted faces, while their parents sipped tea and exchanged pleasantries laced with envy or quiet scandal. The air smelt of fresh grass, strawberries, and the dense, sugary haze of fried batter from the donut stall. Miss Marple, seated comfortably beneath a parasol beside the raffle table, wore a pale blue lace dress and a straw hat with a faded ribbon. She had already observed several curious things that morning. Mrs. Fitch's third husband walking uncomfortably close to Mrs. Albright, the local librarian, Reverend Selwyn's nervous glances toward the bell tower, and the curious absence of Louisa Grenville, usually the fete's self-declared organizer-in-chief. But it was the child that truly caught her attention. He was no more than 7 or 8, red-cheeked and solemn, crouched at the edge of the lawn with colored pencils and a stack of blank sheets. His name was Peter Halstock, Miss Marple recalled, an odd, thoughtful child with a habit of sketching things that hadn't quite happened yet, or perhaps things he ought not to have seen. He had ignored the ring toss, the pony rides, and the magician's show entirely, choosing instead to draw in isolation with uncanny focus. What emerged beneath his hand was not the duck pond or the bunting or the vicar's dog. It was a room none of the fete-goers could recognize. Shuttered windows, floral curtains, a side table with a single broken teacup, and in the middle of the carpet, a man sprawled awkwardly on his side. A red pencil scribbled beneath his head gave the unmistakable impression of blood. "Goodness," murmured Miss Marple softly, blinking behind her spectacles. "That's rather detailed for a child's imagination." She wasn't the only one who noticed. Mrs. Cobb from the flower stall gasped when she saw the drawing and snatched it up with a nervous laugh. "Now, Peter dear," she said, trying to mask her unease, "what sort of thing is this to draw at a nice church fete?" Peter simply looked up at her, puzzled. "It's what I saw," he said, "last night, in the pink house by the hedge." The pink house by the hedges was Roseley Cottage, Miss Louisa Grenville's house. Miss Grenville, it turned out, had not attended the fete because she could not be, nor had she answered her front door all morning, despite the efforts of several ladies to collect the folding chairs she'd promised to lend. 2 hours later, a constable was seen ducking beneath the rose-draped trellis of Roseley's garden, and 30 minutes after that, Reverend Selwyn emerged pale and wordless from the cottage, shaking his head. Louisa Grenville was dead, and the way she had fallen matched the child's drawing almost precisely. Miss Marple, now gently stirring her second cup of tea, sat back in her chair and regarded the village with the quiet, pensive calm of someone who already sensed that something, perhaps many things, were not as they appeared. She glanced over at Peter Halstock, who had returned to his drawing, this time sketching what looked very much like the inside of the vicarage pantry. "Curious child," she said softly, "and curious circumstances indeed." The drawing was never officially mentioned when the police arrived, but that didn't stop it from becoming the central thread of every whispered conversation beneath the bunting that afternoon. Mothers clutched their children tighter, though none could quite articulate why. The vicar's wife insisted Peter must have simply overheard something, perhaps glimpsed a crime drama on the television. She said it with a brittle smile that didn't quite reach her eye. Peter's parents, newly arrived from London and eager to be accepted in the village, spent the remainder of the fete trying to laugh it all away. His mother, delicate and over-perfumed, attempted to explain it as a vivid dream. His father, an overworked accountant with little interest in village matters, muttered that children said all kinds of nonsense, and that the boy had a habit of making things up for attention. Neither, Miss Marple noted, thought to look closely at the drawing itself, but Miss Marple had looked. She had studied the careful shading of the carpet, the way Peter had drawn the teacup in pieces on the floor, the peculiar angle of the man's hand, all astonishingly accurate to the crime scene later described by Constable Hughes in the hushed tones of someone not yet hardened by rural tragedy. Roseley Cottage was now sealed with yellow tape and a quiet police presence, but the heart of the mystery beat louder in the tea rooms and post office than it ever could behind official doors, and that was precisely where Miss Marple turned her attention next. The village postmistress, Miss Finch, was not only in possession of every letter that passed through Little Chipping, but also, more crucially, in possession of every story about its sender. The old woman's memory was as fine as her needlepoint, and her sympathy came hand-stitched with suspicion. She was a brisk woman, Louisa, Mrs. Finch told Miss Marple as she sorted a stack of envelopes with brisk efficiency. Always wore gloves, even in summer, tidy, but there was something about her, clenched, like a cupboard stuffed tooth. Miss Marple, who knew the value of letting others speak, nodded slowly. Clenched. That's very good. And was she, well liked? Oh, people respected her. She didn't take to gossip or nonsense, but liked. No, I wouldn't say so. There was a fuss last year, though she hushed it up nice. Something to do with her nephew, one of those banking types. Came down for a weekend and left with half the silver and her garden mower. Police didn't find him and she didn't press it. Miss Marple raised a pale eyebrow. I see. And was she expecting anyone last night? Mrs. Finch hesitated, then glanced around the empty post office. I wouldn't say this to just anyone, but since it's you, Miss Marple, she did receive a parcel yesterday. Registered post. Very light, oddly shaped. Came from York. She signed for it herself. From York, Miss Marple repeated softly. How peculiar. By mid-morning the next day, the whispers had evolved into theories, and the theories into near certainties. Everyone had a version of events. Louisa Grenville had died of fright after discovering an intruder. She had been poisoned by a rival from the Women's Institute. She had taken her own life after learning of her nephew's second arrest, though this proved untrue when it was revealed no such arrest had occurred. The official cause of death had not yet been released, but a curious detail leaked through Constable Hughes's niece, who worked at the village surgery. Louisa Grenville had suffered a blunt trauma to the head. There had been no signs of forced entry. At the Tuesday morning knitting circle, Miss Marple overheard Mrs. Ackroyd muttering about ghosts and second sight, referencing the child's drawing, with a reverence usually reserved for the Book of Revelation. Others scoffed, but not convincing. The truth was, no one could explain how a child had described the precise layout of a crime scene before it had even been discovered. Miss Marple, her needles clicking softly, offered no opinion, but her mind was already assembling pieces. Later that day, she invited young Peter and his mother to tea. Peter, dressed in a stiff collared shirt and clearly told to be on his best behavior, sat awkwardly on the edge of the floral armchair. His mother sipped tea and apologized twice for the boy's imaginative face. Miss Marple smiled. I think imagination is a great gift, Mrs. Halstock, but sometimes it hides a memory. Peter, dear, you said you saw that room. Do you remember when? Peter blinked, eyes wide. It was dark, but not nighttime. I think it was getting dark. Mummy said we were late for dinner. Miss Marple nodded gently. And where were you when you saw it? The boy hesitated. Behind the roses. There's a bit of garden behind the pink house. If you crouch low, there's a window. Peter, his mother interrupted sharply. That's trespassing. He looked ashamed, but Miss Marple only gave him a gentle pat on the knee. And did you see a person inside, Peter? He nodded. A man. He was shouting, and the lady was standing still, like she was frozen. Then he picked something up, like a vase or lamp. What kind of man? Miss Marple asked. Old? Young? Not old. Not like you, Peter said earnestly. He had shiny shoes and a black coat. The mother gasped. That's quite enough. But Miss Marple smiled, thanked them for their company, and sent them home with a slice of her walnut cake. As the door closed behind them, her mind began to spin faster. A black coat, shiny shoes, no forced entry. Louisa knew her killer. The next morning, she walked with her usual quiet grace to the vicarage, and asked to see Reverend Selwyn. He welcomed her with his usual politeness, but she noticed the tightness at his jawline. There was something brittle about his manner. As he poured her tea with shaking hands, he dropped a spoon which clattered across the table and onto the floor. I hope I'm not intruding, Miss Marple said, watching his eyes rather than his words. Not at all, Miss Marple. It's always a pleasure. Though these are troubled days, aren't they? Indeed. I always find murder rather disrupts the routine. I imagine it does the same for a man of the cloth. He smiled faintly. One tries to shepherd the flock, and Louisa Grenville was part of that flock, she said gently. He paused, stirring his tea longer than necessary. She was a difficult woman, but yes, she was one of ours. Miss Marple let the silence stretch before offering. You knew her nephew, I believe? He flinched, just slightly. Reginald. Yes, he visited once or twice. Didn't seem the sort to linger. Did he wear shiny shoes and a black coat? There was a long pause. He did. Miss Marple leaned back, the soft ticking of the vicarage clock marking time between breaths. She let that information settle, then stood slow. Well, she said lightly, thank you for the tea, Reverend. One never knows what a child might see, or what a village might remember, and with that she left him sitting alone, his teaspoon still turning circles in a teacup long gone cold. Miss Marple did not return home immediately after leaving the vicarage. Instead, she followed a shaded footpath that curved gently around the back of Roseley Cottage, the pink walls now visible through the hedgerow, half-shadowed in the late afternoon sun. A constable still stood at the front gate, arms folded, shifting now and then to ease the discomfort of long hours spent doing very little. Miss Marple had no intention of being seen. Her destination was the garden behind the house, the one Peter had mentioned. It had been some time since she'd wandered this way, but her memory, like a well-kept ledger, recalled the layout precisely. Past the overgrown gooseberry bushes, beneath a trellis that drooped with long-forgotten wisteria, she found the gap in the hedge where a small child might crawl unseen. From there, crouching slightly despite her years, she saw the ground-level window Peter had described. It faced a dim parlor, now deserted and faintly dusty. But what struck her most was how very visible everything was from this angle. Not just the layout, but the teacup, now removed, had clearly shattered beneath that window. The blood, though cleaned, had left a faint discoloration in the carpet. Even the angle of the arm, as Peter had drawn, made perfect sense from this vantage. Peter had seen it, not imagined, and someone had either not noticed him, or not cared that he had seen. As she stood and dusted her skirt, a flicker of movement caught her attention near the edge of the property. A man, tall, neatly dressed, leaning on the garden wall as though awaiting a cue. His coat was black, his hair slicked back in a way that spoke more of city habits than village sensibility. When he noticed Miss Marple watching, he straightened and gave a quick, tight smile. I suppose you're one of the neighbors, he said, stepping forward. Come to gawk at the crime scene? Miss Marple smiled politely. Heaven forbid. No, I was simply enjoying the path. It has a rather pleasant view of the church tower. He looked unconvinced. Well, you're not the only one, Snoop. The local police seem to think I might have had something to do with my aunt's unfortunate demise. Can you believe that? Aunt? Miss Marple echoed softly. Then you must be Mr. Reginald Grenville. Guilty, he said, and offered a, though hopefully not of anything serious. And you are? Jane Marple, she said, shaking his hand. I live just beyond the green, and forgive me, but the police would hardly suspect you without reason. He smirked faintly. Oh, they have reason. Motive. Eve. Aunt Louisa and I weren't exactly close. She didn't approve of me. Not since well, let's say I disappointed the family. But I was in London the night it happened. I've told them as much. Indeed? Miss Marple said. And yet here you are. I came down when I thought it best to show willing. Besides, someone's got to handle her affairs. She didn't have anyone else left, did she? No, Miss Marple said gently. She didn't. She let the silence stretch just long enough for him to fidget. He seemed the sort who disliked silence, preferred to control the rhythm of things. Men like that, she had learned, didn't always need to lie to be dangerous. I don't suppose you've ever been inside Roseley? She asked, tilting her head. He hesitated. Not in years. She never invited me back after that silly nonsense with the mower. Said I had no respect for property. Frankly, I think she enjoyed being offended. Gave her something to hold over people. Yes, Miss Marple said softly. I imagine she'd. As he turned to light a cigarette, one hand flicking the lighter with theatrical precision, Miss Marple's eyes narrowed just slightly. His shoes caught the light, polished to a fault, not the kind worn by someone who walked village paths. Certainly not shoes for muddy hedgerows. They were shoes meant to be seen, meant to suggest importance, the kind of shoes Peter would notice. Reginald drew deeply on his cigarette and gave a long sigh. Well, I suppose I'd better talk to that constable again before they start thinking I've done a runner. Nice meeting you, Miss Marple. And you, Mr. Grenville, she said, her voice pleasantly mild. Do be careful. The village soil has a habit of clinging. He looked down at his gleaming shoes and frowned, just slightly. She waited until he had disappeared toward the front gate before turning and making her way home. That evening, Miss Marple lit her fire and settled into her favorite chair with a notebook in her lap. She wrote 3 names at the top in careful cursive: Louisa Grenville, Reginald Grenville, Reverend Sel. 3 people linked not only by blood and location, but by something darker, something yet unnamed. She underlined Peter's name further down, then made a short list of the things the child had said, each quotation marked with quotation marks. Shiny shoes, black coat, picked something up. One item in particular kept troubling her: the registered parcel from York. The next morning she posted a letter to a niece in Yorkshire, requesting a simple favor, an inquiry into recent mail services near a particular address that she knew Louisa's estranged sister had once resided. If the parcel was truly from York, it might not have come from Reginald at all, but someone clearly wished it to appear as though it had. At the village shop, talk had reached fever pitch. Mrs. Albright was certain Reginald was a bad egg. Miss Drury from the bakery insisted it was the vicar, too quiet by half. Meanwhile, Miss Hartnell, who prided herself on detecting evil through posture alone, had declared the murder was part of an occult ritual, very likely involving belladonna and owl. Miss Marple smiled sweetly at each theory and bought a jar of marmalade, but her real intention was not the marmalade. It was the quiet conversation she managed with Mrs. Pritchard, the housemaid who had worked part-time at Roseley until Louisa's death. "Oh, I don't know much," Mrs. Pritchard said nervously, hands twisting at her apron. "Only that the cottage felt strange that last week, heavy, if you understand. Miss Grenville was jumpy, asked me to clean the same room twice, and there was a broken picture frame in the sitting room. The day before she said it, but the wall was stone, and the hook still intact." "Did she mention anyone visiting?" Miss Marple asked. "She didn't, but there were footprints in the back garden, big ones, fresh mud too, and she hated untidiness. Said nothing, but I caught her scrubbing the doormat herself. Said it was just a little dirt. That wasn't like her." "No," Miss Marple said, tucking that detail away. "I don't suppose it was." As she walked home through the green, the sky clouding faintly above, Miss Marple reflected on how murders in Little Chipping were not like the ones in books. They didn't announce themselves in a thunderclap or with sinister music. They crept into everyday life like a draft through a loose window pane, felt only by those who knew how to sit still and listen. She had listened, and now pieces were beginning to fit, but she needed one more thing. She needed to speak to Peter Halstock again, not about what he had seen but what he had drawn next. It was just after tea the following afternoon when Miss Marple found herself standing at the Halstocks' front gate once more. The modest brick house stood just off the main village lane, its garden neat but unremarkable, save for a scattering of chalk drawings near the path, mostly shapes and stick figures, some now smudged by the breeze or a passing boot. Miss Marple's sharp eyes paused on one near the edge, a tall figure with square shoulders and a dark scribble over its face. Curious, a child's impression of someone they either didn't know, or perhaps didn't want to. Mrs. Halstock answered the door quickly this time. She looked tired, as though the strain of sudden notoriety had started to wear her nerves thin. "Oh," she said, trying to smile. "Miss Marple, I wasn't expecting Peter, darling. Miss Marple is here again." The boy appeared from behind the stairwell, hands smeared faintly with graphite. He carried a fresh sheet of paper clutched against his chest. His expression wasn't afraid, but guarded, as though he'd learned quite recently that sharing what he saw didn't always make adults happy. "I only wanted to ask Peter about one of his drawings," Miss Marple said gently, adjusting the strap of her handbag. "If that's all right with you." Mrs. Halstock hesitated. Then, with a long breath, she nodded. "Peter, would you like to show Miss Marple your new sketch?" Peter glanced at his mother, then nodded slowly, and led the old lady into the sitting room.
He sat cross-legged on the rug, laying out a stack of pages. Some were landscapes, odd and dreamlike, but a few held the same eerie specificity Miss Marple had seen before. One drawing in particular caught her attention. It depicted two figures in a small room. One stood near a cabinet, while the other crouched as if searching through drawers. The walls were lined with books. A familiar-looking lamp glowed dimly in the background. Miss Marple's voice was quiet. "This isn't Roseley Cottage, is it?" Peter shook his head. "Where is it, then?" Peter pointed without hesitation. "That's the room with the books, at the church house, where the tall man lives." Miss Marple looked at him steadily. "Do you mean the Reverend's study?" He nodded. "And when did you see this?" Peter's brow furrowed. "I was hiding, behind the curtain. I wasn't supposed to be there, but the man in the black coat went in. He didn't know I was there." "Was it night?" "No," Peter said. "It was almost night. I went looking for the cat. She hides there sometimes." Miss Marple absorbed the information slowly. "And the man, what did he do?" Peter pointed to the crouching figure. "He was taking papers out of the drawer. He kept looking over his shoulder. Then he folded some up and put them in his coat." "Did he see you?" Peter shook his head. "I stayed quiet." "And you're sure it was the Reverend's study?" "Yes. There's a squeaky step and the carpet has a hole near the edge." That detail struck her like a quiet chime. Reverend Selwyn had once joked about that same hole during a Sunday afternoon tea. Most villagers wouldn't even know it was there. Peter returned to sketching, as if the conversation had ended for him. Miss Marple thanked him softly, then turned to his mother with a reassuring smile. "Your son sees very clearly, Mrs. Halstock. That's a rare and precious thing. Please don't let the village frighten him out of it." The woman nodded, biting her lip. I didn't think it meant anything. But after Louisa, and now this, you were right to be cautious," Miss Marple said. "But now it's time to be careful in another way." That evening, Miss Marple made 2 quiet visits. The first was to the church house. Under the pretext of delivering a jar of quince preserves to the Reverend, he opened the door with an expression that held politeness carefully stitched over fatigue. "Miss Marple," he said, "twice in 1 week. I must be very fortunate, or very troubled." She replied pleasantly. "I thought perhaps some sweetness might help." He smiled faintly, and stepped aside. The sitting room was unchanged since her last visit. Books, stacked in quiet piles, a faint scent of incense, lingering beneath layers of dust and paper. As she handed him the jar, she let her eyes travel across the room toward the hallway beyond. "You must keep your study quite private, I imagine." He followed her gaze but said nothing at first. Then, with a careful tone, "Yes, it's rather a sanctuary, especially late. I imagine there's much to be found in your drawers." There was a long pause before he laughed, a sound that felt slightly too measured. "Old sermons, receipts, donation letters."
She smiled gently. All the things a man of faith might wish to keep private. And then she left, leaving the quince jam and the silence behind her. Her second visit was more direct. That same evening, she sent a note to Constable Hughes requesting a quiet word in confidence. The constable, a decent, plodding man with a genuine respect for Miss Marple's insights, agreed to meet her on the bench beneath the sycamore tree by the post office just after sunset. When he arrived, she handed him a single drawing, Peter's sketch of the study and the 2 men inside it. "I believe one of these men is Reginald Grenville," she said softly, "and I believe the other is in danger of being manipulated." Hughes examined the drawing with a puzzled expression. The child's drawings again. "They are more than drawings," Miss Marple said. "They are observations, accurate ones. Young Peter has a gift for detail, the kind of detail that only comes from seeing with care, not imagining." Hughes was quiet for a long moment, then tapped the edge of the paper with one thick finger. "You think the Reverend is involved? I think he has become entangled. But more importantly, I think Reginald Grenville is not here simply to grieve his aunt or sort her estate. I think he came back to retrieve something his aunt found or threatened to reveal." Hughes rubbed his chin. "And you think he found it in the Reverend's study?" "I think," she said softly, "he knew exactly where to look." By the next morning the village was alive with quiet tension. Reginald had not been seen since the previous evening. The Reverend was said to have cancelled all his appointments, and Miss Marple, serene as always, spent an hour tending her roses. It wasn't until late that afternoon that Constable Hughes returned with news. "You were right," he said, eyes wide. "We found a stack of old letters hidden in the Reverend's desk, tied with ribbon, from Louisa Grenville. All addressed to her solicitor, but never posted. They name Reginald, accuse him of forging her signature on a mortgage years ago. Blackmail, threats, and yet she never mailed them." Miss Marple asked softly. "She was planning to," Hughes said. "That's the odd thing. Her last letter was dated just 3 days before her death. Said she had finally decided to act, that she would leave the papers at the church with someone she trusted." Miss Marple folded her hands. "And Reginald knew. Somehow he knew, or suspected. He followed them here. And when he couldn't find the letters at Roseley, he turned his attention to the only man she might trust." Hughes nodded slowly. "We're issuing a warrant, but he's vanished." "Yes," Miss Marple murmured. "And a man like Reginald won't stay in Little Chipping when the ground begins to shift beneath his shoes." As Hughes departed, she returned to her garden. The sun was setting in streaks of amber and ash. Somewhere nearby a child's laughter echoed, and the air smelled faintly of honeysuckle. The game was not yet over, but the rules were now clear. The following morning broke with a soft drizzle, the kind that blurred the edges of the village and hushed the world into a quiet, damp stillness. Miss Marple sat at her breakfast table, the Morning Post beside her untouched. Her tea had cooled. She was thinking not about Reginald's disappearance, not even about Louisa Grenville's final letter, but about the peculiar intersection of trust and timing. Louisa had written to her solicitor. Yes, but she had not sent the letters. Why? What had she been waiting for? She folded her napkin with slow precision and rose from the table, mind already drawing inward like a thread tightening through fabric. She needed to revisit the one person left in the village who might still be shielding something, perhaps without meaning to. She made her way toward the church house once more. The gravel crunched beneath her feet in that same quiet rhythm, and the sky hung low and gray. When the Reverend answered her knock, he looked different. Not disheveled, he was never that, but as though a certain strength had worn thin, and what remained was paper-thin decorum stretched over real fear. "I expected you," he said simply. Miss Marple offered a faint smile. "Then perhaps it's time we stopped pretending." He stepped aside wordlessly and gestured her into the study. The curtains were half drawn. A lamp flickered against the bookshelves. The scent in the room was different today. Less incense, more dust, and something else she couldn't place. Guilt, perhaps, or memory. "I didn't mean to deceive you," Reverend Selwyn said as he lowered himself into his chair. "I only thought it wasn't my place to speak." "Not your place," she echoed gently. "But you did receive Louisa's letters." His eyes flicked upward. "One. Only one. It arrived 2 days before she died. She asked me to hold it in trust until she made her final decision. She said she would bring the rest herself, but she never did." Miss Marple moved to the fireplace, gazing at the unlit grate. "And you didn't think to read it?" "I did," he admitted. "Once I heard she'd died, I read it. It was addressed to a solicitor, yes, but she enclosed a copy for me. She was afraid, not just of Reginald, but of what exposing him might cost her reputation. Her legacy, she called it." "She didn't trust the law," Miss Marple murmured. "She trusted you." He looked down at his clasped hands. "And I failed her." "No," she said softly, "not failed, but you were outmatched." Reverend Selwyn gave a bitter chuckle. "He came that evening. Said Louisa had mentioned leaving some papers with me. He was charming at first, but there was a sharpness beneath it. You know the kind." "I do," she said. "I told him I knew nothing, that she hadn't visited. He didn't believe me. I saw him again 2 nights later, in the garden. He'd let himself in. He searched your study. I didn't confront him. I couldn't. He frightens me, Miss Marple. Not physically, not quite, but something about the way he watches as if you're already halfway guilty." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Did he take anything?" "I thought not. I kept the letter hidden, tucked inside the old parish ledger. And now, it's gone," the Reverend said hoarsely. "This morning when I went to check, gone." For a moment silence settled like a dropped curtain. Then Miss Marple turned to face him, expression unreadable. "Then there's only one possibility," she said. "He intends to destroy the evidence. Or use it, the Reverend blinked. Use it, for leverage. Reginald is not a man who simply runs. He calculates. If he has the letters, he will wait, watch for weakness. Perhaps he's even still nearby, waiting for the village to breathe again before he decides whether to press his advantage. But what can we do? Miss Marple's eyes, pale and sharp, flicked toward the curtained window. We can be still, we can watch, and we can let him think the ground has settled. By the time she returned to her cottage, the rain had eased into mist. She wrote another note, this one to Constable Hughes, requesting a discreet visit after nightfall. Then she pulled from her sideboard drawer a leather-bound album, faded with age. Inside, a small compartment held a silver brooch, a pair of theater tickets from 1936, and a key. She took the key. As dusk settled over Little Chipping, the village began its slow withdrawal from the world. Lamps glowed behind lace curtains. The pub down the road let out the faint sound of clinking glasses and a muddled tune from the wireless. And in the churchyard, Miss Marple moved quietly along the stone path toward the vestry. She had made the arrangement earlier that day. The vicarage key would be accidentally left under the planter, should the constable wish to take another look at the study. But in truth it was bait. She didn't wait long. Just after 9, a tall figure appeared at the gate. Dark, careful steps, a pause at the planter, then a turn of the key. Miss Marple, hidden behind the yew hedge near the stone arch, held her breath. She waited precisely 3 minutes, then stepped onto the path. Her shoes made no sound on the moss. Inside the study, the light clicked on, and then she entered. Reginald Grenville stood at the desk, drawers already open. His back was turned. He didn't hear her until the door clicked shut. He turned sharply. His eyes widened, not with guilt but calculation. You, I must confess, Miss Marple replied softly. I was hoping it would be you. He studied her. You think you've caught me. I think you've returned for something you missed. Or perhaps to be sure no one else had found it. He said nothing. His hand hovered over the ledge. Miss Marple took a slow step forward. Louisa wrote those letters because she believed silence was no longer protection. But she also knew she had waited too long. So she chose a man she thought would do the right thing, even if it cost him. She was always dramatic, Reginald said, tone mocking, full of speeches, never did know when to let go. She knew you'd come back, Miss Marple said. She knew you couldn't afford to leave it behind. The letters, the accusations, proof of your theft, perhaps even murder. He stiffened. There's no proof of that. There doesn't need to be, she said calmly. You were seen at Roseley Cottage the night she died. By a child, one who draws better than most grown men recall. And now you've broken into the vicarage twice, interfered with stolen documents. It's quite enough, wouldn't you say? A sound came from the doorway. Constable Hughes stepped in, silent, steady, not holding a weapon, but his presence was enough. Reginald's eyes narrowed. This is entrapment. This is observation, Miss Marple said. The same thing you overlooked in Louisa and underestimated in me. He didn't resist. Not immediately, just exhaled slowly, as if calculating how long it might be before he could try again in some other village, some other place. But Little Chipping would not forget, and neither would Peter. As Hughes led him out into the dark, Miss Marple moved to the desk and opened the ledger. She removed the final envelope untouched, it seemed, and held it for a moment in the lamplight. One page. A confession. Louisa's name signed in looping ink. She would ensure it was delivered now properly this time. No more hiding in drawers. No more children needing to speak what grown-ups refused to see. Just truth. However quietly it arrived. The morning after, Reginald Grenville was quietly taken into custody. The village awoke with a strange calm. The mist had lifted. The grass was still damp with memory, and though the market stalls resumed their usual Saturday hum, a noticeable hush remained in conversations. People nodded to one another more slowly. The air felt newly cautious. No one spoke of the arrest outright. It was too soon, too raw. But the absence of disbelief was telling. In Little Chipping, disbelief never lasted long. It was always replaced, quietly and thoroughly, with knowing looks and thin-lipped silence. Miss Marple, for her part, moved through the village with her usual grace, neither seeking out gossip nor avoiding it. She visited the greengrocer. She fetched stamps from Mrs. Finch.
She even stopped by the library to return a volume of Troll. All the while she was listening, not for scandal, but for the tremor beneath it. Villagers had a way of shifting slightly after a death, not just in tone, but in rhythm, and she could feel it now, a new note added to the old tune. What lingered in her mind, however, was not Reginald, nor the letters, nor even the fact that a child had provided the most precise evidence in the case. It was the Reverend Selwyn. Later that day, Miss Marple paid him one last visit. She found him standing in the garden, clipping dead blooms from a line of pale yellow roses. He looked thinner, his movements more careful, as though he were aware of being observed even in solitude. When he noticed her approaching, he set down the shears and straightened, his expression tired but honest. "I rather thought you might come," he said. Miss Marple inclined her head. "I dislike leaving threads undone." He offered a faint smile. "Would you walk with me?" She nodded, and they strolled slowly along the garden's edge. The breeze rustled through ivy and lavender, the scent softening the air between them. "I've been thinking," the Reverend said, "about what it means to be trusted. It's a strange thing. We always believe trust is a comfort, but sometimes it feels like a burden, like walking across thin ice, trying not to crack it." Miss Marple glanced at him, her voice gentle. "You never wanted to be the keeper of secrets, did you?" "No," he said, "but somehow people bring them to me anyway." "It's not surprising," she said. "You listen without judgment. You carry silences better than most." But Louisa's silence, it left others vulnerable. He nodded slowly. "I should have insisted she go to the police." "She wouldn't have," Miss Marple said firmly. "She valued her reputation more than she feared Reginald. That was her mistake, not yours. But we all have our weaknesses." He was quiet for a time, then said, "There's something I didn't tell Constable Hughes, something I hesitated to tell anyone." Miss Marple stopped walking. "I'm listening." He took a slow breath. "Louisa didn't bring me the letters to protect herself. She brought them to protect someone else." "Who?" "A child. Not Peter. Someone she'd once helped, years ago. A young girl named Clara. She was Louisa's housemaid for a short while. Very timid, very bright. Reginald had taken an interest in her. Louisa intervened, quietly, and sent the girl away to work for a cousin in Basingstoke. But Reginald never forgot. Louisa mentioned in her letter that she feared Reginald had found her, that he might be using that knowledge threatening to hurt Clara to keep Louisa quiet. That was her real fear." Miss Marple felt the chill of it settle in her spine. "And did he find her?" "I don't know. Louisa never said. Only that she was running out of time, and that she couldn't protect everyone at once." Miss Marple thought for a moment. Then if he had the letters, and thought they were the only evidence of Clara's past, or his threat, he would try to destroy them, the Reverend said, or use them to control the narrative. And if Clara still exists, and still fears him, she may never come forward. "Exactly," he said quietly, "and without her that part of the story dies." Miss Marple's gaze drifted toward the distant line of hills. "Not necessarily." She turned to him. "I need to see something. May I borrow the key to the vicarage office?" He handed it to her without hesitation. An hour later, Miss Marple sat once more at the Reverend's desk. She had brought with her a magnifying glass, and a small tin box containing letters of her own. She had learned long ago that real stories seldom resided in what people said outright, but in what they overlooked. She opened the parish ledger, the place Louisa had hidden her copy of the letter. Beneath the glued spine, she noticed an uneven strip of paper. Gently, she worked it loose. A second envelope, this one unsealed. Inside a folded photograph, faded at the edges, but unmistakably, Louisa's handwriting across the back. "Clara, June 1949. God keep her safe." The girl in the photo had soft eyes and a hesitant smile, and beside her, barely in frame, stood a much younger Reginald Grenville, his arm extended behind her in what could be a casual pose, or a possessive one. Miss Marple held the photo to the light. The background was unfamiliar, but a painted sign behind the girl read St. Agnes Home, Basingstoke. There was a clue yet to be followed. That evening she sent a telegram to her cousin Lucy, in Basingstoke, requesting discreet inquiries into any staff records at St. Agnes from. She did not expect immediate results, but time had never been her enemy. She had learned, through loss and love and long years of silence, that patience was the true detective's gift. 2 days later the reply arrived. "Clara Mills, former resident, Now Clara Eversby, retired nurse, currently living in South Sea, willing to speak, memory still strong, grateful for warning. It was all the confirmation she needed. She passed the information to Constable Hughes, who promised to arrange the necessary interviews, and reassured her that Clara's identity would be protected. She trusted him. He was not brilliant, perhaps, but he was kind, and steady, and more open to nuance than his uniform might suggest. As she sat alone that evening, Miss Marple looked again at the drawing Peter had made of the Reverend's study. His lines were clearer now, each pencil stroke a kind of testimony. Children drew what they couldn't yet name, but in that wordlessness, they sometimes captured truth more purely than any adult ever could. She would speak to Peter once more before the story came to rest. That Sunday, as the congregation filtered out of the church, Peter lingered beside the yew trees, sketchpad in hand. Miss Marple approached him gently. "I saw the photograph," she said softly. "You were right again. You saw something everyone else ignored." Peter didn't look up. "People don't like it when I say what I see." "I know," she replied, "but that doesn't mean you should stop seeing." He finally met her gaze. "Is it over?" She smiled, brushing a curl of hair from his forehead. "Almost, and it was." Reginald Grenville was charged not only with fraud and tampering with correspondence, but now also placed under investigation in connection with the disappearance of Clara Mills decades prior. Though no crime was yet confirmed, still it was enough to keep him where he could do no more harm. Louisa's name, though whispered in conflict for years, was finally spoken with something close to respect, and Clara Eversby, safe in her quiet coastal town, began writing a memoir. Privately at first, Miss Marple received the first pages in a pale blue envelope, each line careful, deliberate, as if Clara had waited her whole life for someone to believe her story mattered. Miss Marple set the letter beside her tea, and looked out the window at the village, its rooftops soft against the fading sky. Injustice didn't always roar. Sometimes it lingered like a shadow behind good curtains and bright smiles. But in little Chipping for now, the curtain had lifted, and light, gentle, steady light had returned. It was on the fourth morning after Reginald Grenville's arrest that the calm in Little Chipping began to subtly fracture again. The mood in the village had begun to shift from tension to relief, the way a tightly wound clock begins to unwind. Cautious, but relief, Miss Marple knew, was a fragile thing, built not on the truth, but on the hope that enough had been uncovered to close the book. And yet something still lingered. She felt it not in any single moment, but in the silence between conversations, in the way Reverend Selwyn now paused before unlocking his door, or how Mrs. Halstock had begun drawing her curtains slightly earlier. Each evening, a kind of unfinished chord hummed beneath the surface. Miss Marple had always trusted such silences. They were more telling than any confession. That morning, she received a letter from Clara Eversby, written in a soft, careful hand. It filled 3 pages, and carried with it an unmistakable sense of purpose. Clara had written more than just her memories of Reginald. She had remembered a detail, a small one, but chilling in its precision. Louisa had sent Clara away to Basingstoke, not just to protect her from Reginald's inappropriate attention, but because Clara had witnessed something far worse. Clara had been in the room, hiding, terrified, the night Reginald had struck his father, the elder Mr. Grenville, a stiff and proper man from an old county family, had died that night in what was ruled a heart failure. No post-mortem had been requested, no questions, but Clara had seen the younger Reginald push him in anger, watched him fall against the hearth. The silence that followed, she said, was thicker than the blow. Louisa had known. She had cleaned the room. She had told Clara to forget what she saw. "You were dreaming," "You were never there." And Clara, young and vulnerable, had believed her, until the nightmares returned, sharper with age. Now, decades later, she had remembered the position of the chair, the fall, the blood that Louisa had carefully scrubbed from the edge of the cup. Miss Marple folded the letter slowly, her fingers resting on the last line. "I don't know if I can forgive Louisa, but I think she always meant to protect me, only she did it in the only way she knew." Silence. There was no statute now, no charge to be pressed, but it reframed everything.
Louisa's fears had not begun recently. They had run like roots beneath her life, winding deep. And perhaps she had never truly forgiven herself for the first cover-up. Miss Marple knew what she must do. She returned that afternoon to Roseley Cottage, now empty, the police tape long removed, the windows shuttered. The property had technically reverted to the Crown, while legal matters were resolved. But a polite inquiry and her reputation had been enough to secure brief access. Constable Hughes met her at the gate. "I thought we'd put this one to bed," he said, not unkindly. "Sometimes a case is closed, but not complete." Miss Marple said softly, "There may be one more piece." Together, they stepped inside. The sitting room remained largely untouched. Louisa's furnishings stood like beautiful sentries, neat, proper, and silent. The carpet, freshly cleaned, still held a faint mark near the hearth. Miss Marple's eyes swept the room with deliberate slowness. Clara said, "There was a broken tile beneath the fender," she murmured. "Cracked during the fall. Louisa covered it with a rug for years, even in summer." She stepped forward, knelt beside the fire grate, and gently lifted the woven mat. There it was, a single tile, hairline fractured in a shape that matched a downward impact. "I imagine the crack was dismissed at the time," she said, half to herself, just as Clara's memories were. Constable Hughes crouched beside her. No blood, no weapon, no witnesses, just a broken tile. "But someone did see," Miss Marple said. "And someone remembered." She rose slowly. The evidence would not lead to a courtroom now, but the truth had to be named, even if only quietly. Silence had served its purpose and caused its harm. Back at home, she penned a final letter to Clara. "My dear Mrs. Eversby, I visited Roseley Cottage this afternoon and saw what you remembered. The broken tile remains, and I believe you, not because the world demands proof, but because the proof lies in what no one ever thought to question. You are not alone in memory anymore. Yours faithfully, Jane Marple." As she sealed the envelope, a knock came at the door. To her surprise, it was Peter Halstock. He stood there, his usual sketch pad tucked under one arm, his fingers nervously twisting at the corner of a page. "I made you something," he said simply. She invited him in and settled him at the table with a glass of milk and a biscuit, then examined the drawing. It was the village green rendered in surprising detail for a child his age, and in the corner, almost as an afterthought, stood a figure beside the tea table, a woman in a straw hat, another child standing beside her. Peter looked up at her. "That was the day you saw my first drawing," he said. "The day, Louisa, when everything changed." Miss Marple nodded, touched. "Yes, I remember." Peter's brow furrowed. "Will there be more bad people?" "There will always be people who do wrong," she said gently. "But there will also be people who notice, who remember, He considered that, then looked down at his hands. "I'm going to keep drawing. I hope you do," she said. "You see the world as it is. Not everyone can." When he left, the cottage felt unusually still. Miss Marple settled by the window, teacup in hand, and watched the late sun gild the hedges with gold. Reginald Grenville would not return. His arrogance had been his undoing, his belief that power and silence were stronger than truth. But it had been a child who first cracked the line, a vicar who hesitated, but chose conscience over fear, a woman in Southsea who finally let memory speak, and an old lady who listened. That evening, as she sat beneath the fading light, Miss Marple allowed herself the smallest of smiles. Not all justice came in courtrooms. Sometimes it came in drawings, in broken tiles, in letters that never reached the post. And sometimes it came in the quiet voice of someone who had watched the world long enough to know that evil, no matter how cleverly dressed, always left a thread uncut. She would keep watch, because in Little Chipping, as everywhere else, there were always new threads beginning. The tension that had gripped Little Chipping like a tight collar had eased, but only slightly. People still spoke in undertones at the bakery. The vicar's sermons were quieter, more contemplative. Even the roses along the main road seemed slower to bloom, as if the very soil remembered what had been disturbed. Miss Marple, true to her nature, did not assume the matter was finished simply because others hoped it was. Truth, she knew, did not always reveal itself in dramatic declaration. Sometimes it waited. Sometimes it hid in the folds of something as ordinary as a handwritten note or the forgotten contents of a drawer. That was why, even as the village tried to return to normal, she found herself thinking once more of Louisa Grenville. There had always been something about Louisa that resisted clarity. Her sharpness, her relentless pride, her almost obsessive control over her affairs. None of these traits explained her final week. Miss Marple had seen it before in women who lived alone, the meticulous routines, the guarded expressions, the secret boxes of letters that were never posted. But what still troubled her wasn't Louisa's fear of Reginald. It was something more private, almost shameful, in the way she had hidden those letters, in the way she had hesitated to send them even when she'd resolved to speak. Miss Marple returned to Roseley Cottage late one afternoon, this time alone. Constable Hughes had given her the key for one last visit before the property was handed over for probate. She let herself in through the front door, the familiar creak of the hinge, echoing like a voice that didn't belong to anyone anymore. Inside, the rooms were still. A faint film of dust had begun to settle over the polished wood. It was not a place of violence now, but of silence, of things left unsaid. She moved to the study. There the furniture remained exactly as Louisa had arranged it, the wingback chair turned slightly toward the fire, the writing desk locked, the bookshelf in perfect alignment. Miss Marple studied the books for a moment, titles mostly unremarkable, gardening guides, historical novels, several volumes of Trollope and Elizabeth Gaskell, but her eyes landed on a slim blue volume tucked awkwardly at the end of the second shelf. It didn't quite fit with the others. She pulled it free. It was a ledger of sorts, not financial, something more personal. The first pages were blank, but halfway through, Louisa's handwriting began to appear careful, slanted, formal. They were notes, observations. May 12th, he was seen again in the lane near the schoolhouse. Claimed to be visiting the estate agent. I don't believe him. May 17th, Clara's letter arrived, unlied. The writing, however, is unmistakable. She's frightened. I shouldn't have involved her again. Miss Marple turned the page. May 22nd, I've copied the most damning document. The originals will be left in the cabinet, as he expects. If he returns, let him take them. I want him to feel clever. Meanwhile, the real ones go to the church. Miss Marple drew a slow breath. A decoy. Louisa had anticipated that Reginald might break in again. She had deliberately left false letters in her cabinet to draw him off the scent. But that raised another question. Where were the real originals? She flipped further. June 1st. If anything happens to me, Jane will know what to do. She sees things others overlook. I've never told her everything, how could I? But I think she'll understand. There it was. That quiet nod of trust. That faint, elegant thread stretching between two women who had known one another through years of village functions, teas and silent glances, that carried more weight than many confessions. Miss Marple turned the final page, and a small envelope fell free. It bore her name. Inside was a single sheet. The ink was fading, but legible. Dear Jane, if you are reading this, something has happened. Perhaps I've grown too afraid, or perhaps the worst has occurred. I can't say which. You've always been able to read between the lines, so I'll trust you now with the last truth I couldn't say aloud. Reginald knows about the garden box. I buried the originals beneath the old pear tree, beneath the stones where we used to hide. Mayday, if they are found, they will prove what I was too late to undo. Forgive me for the delay, for the cowardice, for everything. Louisa. Miss Marple folded the letter with trembling fingers, and sat for a long moment, the room pressing in with memory. The pear tree, the garden. She left the house quickly, the envelope clutched in her hand. Roseley's garden had once been Louisa's greatest pride. It had been the one thing she showed freely. Her roses, her herbs, the trimmed box hedge she shaped like a swan each summer. And in the far corner behind the creeping clematis, stood the gnarled old pear tree, its limbs now heavy with greenish fruit. Miss Marple moved toward it, scanning the ground beneath. The Mayday stones were still there, flat slabs half buried in the soil, laid long ago in a mosaic pattern by village children. She knelt slowly, brushing leaves aside. The stones shifted easily. Beneath them, the earth gave way to a small metal box, rusted slightly at the corners. She opened it. Inside were the original letters, not copies, typed, signed, dated, legal correspondence, banking records, a forged signature comparison, evidence of Reginald's long manipulation of Louisa's finances and her silence. There were notes too, Clara's early statements, Louisa's own list of events, dates she had paid him hush money, The box was a map of a crime buried over years. Miss Marple closed the lid and rose with quiet dignity. It was over now, truly over. That evening she delivered the box to Constable Hughes, along with Louisa's note. He received them with grave understanding, offering no triumph, no surprise, just a slow nod and a muttered, "She was braver than we knew. She always was," Miss Marple said softly. In the weeks that followed, the village returned to something like peace. There was no trial. Reginald had already fled before his arrest, and though the search continued, it was clear he would not return. But with the evidence recovered and Clara's testimony secure, there would be no question now. The truth had reached the surface, and Louisa Grenville, once known only for her strictness and formality, would be remembered for something else entirely. Peter Halstock brought Miss Marple one last drawing a week later. It was of the garden, the pear tree, a woman in a blue coat, standing with her back turned, watching something buried rise into light. Miss Marple pinned it to her wall above the mantel. Some people needed portraits, others had flowers named after them. But Louisa had left behind something quieter, something firmer. She had left behind the truth, and Miss Marple, as always, had listened. It rained softly the night after the garden box was recovered, a quiet drizzle that seemed more like a hush than a storm. The cobbles in Little Chipping gleamed under the street lamps, and the pear tree behind Roseley stood darker than the rest of the garden, as if it too had secrets still to hold. But for Miss Marple, the tension that had gripped her since the fete had begun to settle. Threads had been tied, the truth retrieved. She had done what Louisa had quietly entrusted her to do, and yet, as always, something small tugged at her thoughts. Not a doubt, but an echo. The next morning, Miss Marple found herself rising earlier than usual. She felt it in her hands, the instinct that a chapter had turned, but the book had not yet closed. Clara's testimony had been accepted, the forged records from the garden box authenticated, and Reginald's absence had been elevated to national notice. The London police had circulated his photograph. He was gone, but not invisible. Hughes believed it only a matter of time. Still, Miss Marple believed in time differently, not as a guarantee, but as a question always waiting to be answered. She dressed with care and walked slowly to the church. The Reverend was in his garden, pruning a clematis that had been left untamed for too many seasons. He looked better, less gaunt, more present in his gestures. He smiled when he saw her, though his eyes retained a shadow. "Miss Marple," he said, wiping his hands on a cloth, "a quiet morning." "They usually are," she replied, "until they aren't." He gave a soft chuckle. "I suppose I'll never think of quiet quite the same again." "I doubt any of us will," she said. "But I'm afraid I've come with one more question." The Reverend raised an eyebrow, then nodded. "Shall we go inside?" They sat once more in the study, now dusted and straightened, with a new bulb in the lamp and a sense of fresh order in the room. Miss Marple placed her gloved hands gently on her lap. "Louisa trusted you, Reverend, enough to leave you with her final act of protection. But there's something I've wondered about. The envelope she gave you." He nodded. "Yes. You said she handed it to you personally, to keep it safe. But I've come to wonder, was that the only thing she gave you?" His expression shifted, barely perceptible. "What do you mean?" "She left a second letter," Miss Marple said. "In the garden box, addressed to me. She made reference to something you might have known, the existence of the decoy papers, for instance. But more curiously, she wrote something else, that she'd copied the most damning documents, implying they existed somewhere else in full. But as it happens, the documents I found were originals." The Reverend frowned. "So the question is, where are the copies?" Miss Marple gave a faint smile. "Precisely." He looked down for a moment, then slowly reached toward the lowest drawer in his desk. With a soft click, he opened it and drew out a slim folder, its cover marked only with a single paperclip. "I wasn't sure I'd ever be asked," he said. "She gave these to me 2 days before she died. Said they were her safety net. If anything happened to the ones in the box." He handed the folder to Miss Marple, who opened it with quiet precision. Inside were photocopies, slightly faded but legible, of every document she had discovered under the pear tree. "She was thorough," Miss Marple murmured. The Reverend nodded. "She was frightened, but deliberate. She told me to give them to the authorities only if she went missing, or if anyone tried to silence me. When Reginald came to search the house, I moved them to the base of the organ pipes. Even if he'd torn this room apart, he wouldn't have found them. Miss Marple closed the fold. Then we have her full record. We do. She looked at him carefully. And now, what will you do? He exhaled slowly. I've sent my resignation to the bishop. She tilted her head. Resignation. There's more than one kind of complicity, Miss Marple. I didn't speak when I should have. I let fear dictate my caution, and I let Louisa shoulder too much. You were human, she said gently. That's not a failing, it's a reminder. He looked at her with something like gratitude, but she saw too that his decision was already made. He would leave quietly, as so many quiet men did once their part was done. She left him at the church gate, the smell of the damp earth curling around the gravestones, and turned toward home. But she didn't go inside. Instead, she took the footpath past the schoolhouse, then turned left down the narrow lane where the hedgerows grew thick and wild. It led past the very place Peter had first spoken of, the rose garden behind Rosalie, where he had hidden and watched and drawn. She stopped where the path bent around the back of the house, where the stones still showed signs of being shifted. The hedgerow beside them was denser than before, overgrown, even in the few weeks that had passed. And there at the edge of the brush, she saw it, a footprint, not a child, a man's, fresh, the shape of a heel deepened by weight, the tip of a polished sole too narrow for any boot worn by the villagers who might wander this way. Someone had returned, after the evidence was found, after the papers were delivered. Someone had come to see whether the truth had been truly buried or if more might still be uncovered. Miss Marple stood very still. The wind was quiet. No sound of birds, no crunch of gravel. Whoever had left that print was not there now. But they had been, and recent. She crouched, examined the edge of the hedge. A few brambles broken, a small patch of cloth navy blue caught on a thorn. It wasn't over. Reginald Grenville or someone close to him had come back, and they hadn't found what they were looking for. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple laid the scrap of cloth beside the drawing Peter had given her. The blue of the fabric almost matched the coat in the picture. Almost. She poured herself a cup of tea, her hands perfectly steady. It was time to return to Pete, because children didn't always just see what others missed. Sometimes they saw what others refused to believe, and sometimes they drew it, not just what had happened, but what was still to come. The village was beginning to draw its curtains for the evening, but she moved with quiet urgency, a sense of something half-seen beginning to take shape in her mind. She carried with her a small envelope inside it, the scrap of navy cloth caught on the thorned hedge. It wasn't much, but it was the kind of detail that didn't simply blow in from nowhere. Not in a village like Little Chipping. Peter answered the door before she even knocked. I saw you coming, he said plainly. From the wind. His mother appeared a moment later, flustered and slightly breathless, as if she'd just come from the back garden. Miss Marple, what a surprise. Please do come in. I won't be long, she said gently. Just a word with Peter, if I may. Mrs. Halstock hesitated. Is something wrong? Miss Marple glanced down at the boy who was already heading toward the sitting room with a purposeful stride, his sketchpad under one arm. Not wrong, no, but something may not be quite finished. She followed Peter into the sitting room. She left the Halstocks just after twilight, the sketch tucked safely into her handbag. Her next stop was the police station. Constable Hughes was still at his desk, half buried in paperwork, but he looked up quickly when she entered. I had a feeling, he said. You always come when things are about to shift. Miss Marple gave him the page. This car was spotted behind Rosalie Cottage. Yesterday evening. A figure seen again, moving quietly. Not Reginald. Someone else. Hughes studied the drawing. I'll check the plates, might be enough to pull something. She paused before speaking again. There's one more thing I need to say, and I suspect it won't be welcome. His eyes flicked up. Go on. If it wasn't Reginald, it might be someone working with him, or worse, someone who's benefited from the silence all along. Someone who knew about the forged documents. Someone who realized the garden box had been found and needed to make sure nothing else would come to light. Hughes's jaw tightened. You think we missed someone? I think we always miss someone. And I think Louisa Grenville knew it too. He tapped a pen against his ledger. We'll keep watch. I'll have an officer patrol the Roseley grounds overnight. Quietly. Make sure it's someone discreet, she said. This sort of person doesn't act unless they think no one's watching. When she returned home, the house was dark except for the lamp beside her armchair. She poured herself a cup of tea and sat beside the window, staring out over the village as shadows stretched across the rooftop. She thought of the man in the dark coat. Not Reginald, but someone connected. A link in the chain they hadn't yet uncovered. And she thought of Peter's drawing. The deliberate omission of a face. The cold angles of the car. Just before midnight, there was a soft knock at her door. She rose slowly, cautious but unafraid, and opened it to find Reverend Selwyn standing on her step, soaked from the rain, his coat clinging to him. I needed to speak to someone, he said. She stepped aside to let him in. Of course, come by the fire. He sat stiffly, not touching the tea she poured, hands folded too tightly in his lap. There's something I didn't tell you, he said after a moment. Something I didn't even admit to myself until this evening. She waited. It's about Reg. Years ago when I first arrived here, he approached me privately, told me he was handling certain family matters and that Louisa could be volatile. That if she ever came to me with stories I should remember that she had episodes. Miss Marple blinked. He was discrediting preemptively. The Reverend nodded. And I listened. I didn't question him. I thought I was being pastoral, but now I think I was being managed. She let the silence stretch for a moment. And why tell me this now? Because this evening after evensong, I saw a man in the trees behind the vestry. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. Describe him. I didn't get a good look, but he moved like he knew exactly where he was going, toward the path behind Roseley. She stood slowly. Then we must assume he's still here. He looked up, the fear in his eyes not for himself, but for the village. I think someone else has taken up the threads, he said. And I fear they're not done pulling. Miss Marple nodded once. It seems, she said, the story isn't quite finished after all. Miss Marple rose early, dressed in a navy cardigan and her walking shoes, and stepped into the calm morning with a steady purpose. The Reverend's visit the night before, the fresh footprint behind Roseley, and Peter's drawings had crystallized something in her mind. Not a sudden revelation, but a pattern slowly coming into focus, like ink rising through blotting paper. She stopped by the police station at 7:30 sharp. Constable Hughes was already there, weary-eyed but alert. She handed him the slip of paper she had written the night before. 4 names, written in her neat, deliberate script. Only one was underlined. I believe your man is closer than you think, she said. But you'll need discretion. If we act too directly, he'll vanish just as Reginald did. Hughes studied the list. You're certain? Enough to risk being wrong, she replied. But I don't think I am. By 8 the plan was in motion. Miss Marple returned to Roseley Cottage with Hughes and another plainclothes officer stationed out of sight. She brought a small picnic basket and a folded chair, claiming she'd promised to tidy up Louisa's herb patch for the gardening society. No one questioned her. And so she waited, pruning lavender with gloved fingers, the garden around her still and expectant. An hour passed. Then 2. It was just after 10 when she heard it, the soft creak of the back gate. A shadow moved along the hedge, the same path Peter had drawn. A man emerged, tall, careful, dressed in a charcoal coat. Not Reginald Grenville. It was Mr. Arden, the solicitor who had handled Louisa Grenville's affairs for the past decade. Quiet, well-regarded, rarely spoken of beyond the words discreet and reliable. Miss Marple had remembered him from parish events, always present but never lingering, and more importantly always close to Louisa's financial life. She did not move. He stepped toward the old pear tree, crouched, and began feeling along the stone board. She waited until his fingers reached the loose slab Peter had so carefully rendered in his drawing. Then she spoke softly but clearly, looking for something. Mr. Arden. He froze, straightened slowly. His eyes met hers. I didn't see you there, he said. No, I imagine you didn't. You were rather occupied with your work. Though I must say, I'd thought you'd found what you needed the first time you came. He tilted his head slightly. I don't know what you mean. I think you do. Louisa Grenville trusted you with her documents for years. She believed you protected her interests, but somewhere along the line you began protecting someone else's. His face remained unreadable. You believe I helped Reginald. I believe you guided him, Miss Marple said. When he returned to Little Chipping, he didn't go to Louisa first. He went to you. You told him she'd grown suspicious. You likely even warned him about the garden box. But you also underestimated her. She sent copies elsewhere. You thought you could control the damage, but she was a step ahead. Arden said nothing. I imagine you were paid handsomely for your silence, she went on. And when Reginald fled, you expected the matter would settle. But then the child drew the scene. The box was found. The letters surfaced, and you realized there might still be something left behind, something unaccounted for. Still he said nothing. So she gave him the final detail. Peter saw you. He didn't know your name, but he drew your posture. Not Reginald's. Yours. You came to the cottage twice, maybe more, and this time you've returned for the originals. Perhaps to destroy them. Perhaps to retrieve what Reginald entrusted to you. He glanced behind him only once. That was all Constable Hughes needed. The officers stepped from their posts with quiet precision. Mr. Arden did not resist. He only sighed and lowered himself to sit on the garden bench beside the swan hedge. It was over. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple sat with Hughes in his office, a fresh cup of tea in her hand, and a plate of plain biscuits between them. The confession had come quickly. Arden had forged legal cover for Reginald's embezzlement over years, skimming from Louisa's investments, hiding financial manipulation behind jargon and stamps. When she began asking too many questions, he'd warned Reginald. Reginald, impulsive and desperate, had confronted her, and Louisa had died, whether by accident or fury remained unresolved. Arden insisted he hadn't been there that night, but he had tried in his quiet way to clean the mess, to erase trace, to bury not just the truth, but the very possibility of it. Why do they always think no one's watching? Hughes asked aloud. Because they think watching means suspicion, Miss Marple said. But it doesn't. It means remembering, noticing, listening, which is something men like that never quite learn. She rose slowly, folding her gloves into her handbag. What will happen to Peter? Hughes asked, not quite looking up. He'll go on drawing, she said with a smile. And in time I think he'll understand just how much he saw. The story of Louisa Grenville faded slowly from village talk, becoming part of the quiet fabric of Little Chipping, the way all extraordinary things are eventually woven into ordinary life. But some things lingered. The pear tree bloomed brighter that spring. Clara Eversby sent a letter of thanks and a pressed daisy, and Peter drew less in black and more in green. One afternoon, weeks later, he handed Miss Marple a final sketch. It showed a village garden, a woman in a straw hat tending flowers, a child crouched behind a hedge, sketching, and at the edge of the scene, a man slipping away down a path, already fading into shadow. Miss Marple smiled, folded the picture carefully, and placed it in the drawer with the rest of her memories. Justice, she knew, was not always loud, but in Little Chipping, it had spoken. She had heard every word.